Okay, Saturday afternoon, April the 19th, I did a little field trip in the afternoon. The Supreme Court building has some construction going on. There weren't very many people around, despite the fact that early that Saturday morning, the court had ruled against Trump in this case, this deportation case. I think it's Garcia, and to slow down. There weren't very many protesters around. There's one from Texas when I went to the mall, and there's another one. One of them said resist Trump. There was another one, the balls to common. And let's just go to that was another one. Let's go to just a few other pictures. There's some construction around the Cannon building, and there's another Supreme Court picture. And there's the Library of Congress, and the Capitol, and some more construction around the Cannon building. And that's about all I saw yesterday. I didn't go to the right places for the protest. There was a protest at somebody's house. I don't go to those. Mostly about the situation with the deportations without proper due process. I'm not getting into that in detail. It's Easter Sunday, but I want to talk about just something, go back to the baseline of what some of this stuff meant for me. Well, also, just let me show you real quickly. There's a map. There's where the Capitol is. The Supreme Court is right up here, and it's the mall is down here, and the Washington and no, the Supreme Court's right there. I'm sorry, it's not. I'm kind of misreading it. The Supreme Court's right there, and there's the Congress, and it's right across from Congress. Capitol Metro is there, and the mall is out here. But I had the pointer in the wrong place. It's right there. And just to mention also, in the third book, I did not take up the idea of oppressor versus oppressed groups, or I didn't take up the idea of trans or gender identity at all. I talked about everything in terms of the individual responsibility when the individual, like me, finds that he doesn't fit in. And that's what I want to talk a little more about today. That it was just after that you would start hearing about gender stuff, but it wouldn't be for 3 or 4 more years before you heard about it very often. Um, when I was growing up, I grew up in the 1950s. I graduated from high school in 1961. The idea was boys were expected to grow up to be strong and be prepared to protect women and children when they grew up, to serve in the military. That's one of the things about the draft. We don't talk about it much today, that we still have selective service system. We don't require women, biological women, that is, to register. Trans, yeah, you have to, your registration requirement is by biological sex only. Nobody seems to be talking about that very much. But there was a lot of pressure on me. Like in third grade, I started taking piano in third grade and got into that. And if I had focused more on that, I might have gotten to where I could have made music my career. I didn't quite specialize enough in any one thing to make it a career like I wish I might have. And it wasn't easy for boys to do that in the 50s with the political situation. Um, but I got this idea that I could play the brains over brawn game, sort of the most dangerous game thing story. That book smarts could topple street smarts. And I got a sort of, I was bad in PE. I was behind. I was teased. The third grade teacher made a lot of that, and that I had to be brought up to speed physically. I never really learned to swim very well. Um, just barely passed that in phys ed and school. I wasn't very good at tumbling. I couldn't move my body through the air and keep my balance. I had a problem with that. I had dyspraxia. That's what they call it, I think. Might have been because of the measles after second grade, or before second grade, that in the summer. Might have been something my mother had, when I was born, an epigenetic thing. But I was an only child, so it wasn't the usual explanation. But I grew up with the idea, that as a boy, I would have to be responsible for girls, and yet part of the thing about sex was avoiding. Well, if you get a girl pregnant, you're going to be responsible for the baby. I was taught that. But sexual attraction was looked at as something that every boy has naturally. And people didn't seem to realize not everybody had a strong sense of attraction to women when they saw them. When I got to college, you know how things blew up. I've talked about that in my screenplays, particularly December 26th, the screenplay about the short film about the expulsion. Wasn't so much what I did do as what I didn't do, but they were very thrown by the fact I wasn't interested in girls. And then in the context of dorm life then, that meant I was gay, which I admitted. I admitted to being attracted to men, and you know the story thereafter, and the expulsion. And I had this idea of that it was a good thing to be attracted to strong role model type men. If you were encouraging goodness, you were encouraging competence. If you couldn't be one yourself, you could be paired with one. And that was the way I felt. And you could find that. And that kind of became a life goal. But there's a very downside of that. Once society became more liberal after Stonewall, and more people started doing that as things opened up, it worked, and things got, and we, first of all, it got dangerous for society because of the AIDS epidemic, the sudden possibility that a lot of men, in a chain could suddenly spread an unusual disease, and that presented a risk that Texas bill in 1983, 2138, that almost passed that story. But we got through that, as threatening as it was. I was living in Dallas then. We got through all that, and things got better in the 90s to the point that we considered um, talking about allowing gays to serve in the military, and the idea that you might be theoretically attracted to someone in your unit, which doesn't really happen in practice when you're in your basic training. You're so preoccupied with training, you don't think about it. But the theoretical idea, of course, was an issue of privacy, and that was the same idea that I'd had on the dorm, which I basically made the basis of books and sort of drove that idea, along with the idea that liberty should be an individual thing. You should be thinking about liberty in terms of individual rights and responsibilities, but not everything. And so gay rights came along from that, the right to have relations with other adults in private without the interference of the state. Got to Lawrence after Hardwick versus Bowers failed in '86. We finally got to Lawrence versus Texas, and but then the idea, as society became more individualistic, um, and particularly with with the issue of smartphones, becoming prominent in the early 2010s, and people using it so much to socialize, society started becoming very fragmented, and men started falling way behind, except for very talented high IQ men who knew how to set up YouTube channels and draw millions of visitors. Except for those, for a lot of men, with women didn't need them to be supporting. Women were getting better than men in school and in college and making a living, and men were falling behind. It became a very serious problem, which was one of the reasons why Trump won the second term. But there was, the idea along the way in the past that men had a responsibility, not just simply to avoid getting somebody pregnant and not be ready to support them, but they had a responsibility to start dating and courting girls and finding a wife and having children and raising a family their primary way of having accountability for any public life they wanted. And that included men spending a lot of attention on other skills, not just brain skills, but some of the brawn skills and some of the practical skills, changing your own oil type of thing, the pay your dues kind of stuff, which I wasn't very good at. And I dated girls, for one girl particularly, for a while, like in 1971 particularly. And it was interesting. And because you weren't supposed to touch anyone, you could pretend you could go a long way with dating someone for a long time. But eventually, if you were going to form a relationship and get married and have children, I'd have to be able to consummate the marriage. And eventually, whether the woman has the confidence that I would could become an issue. Now, I mean, women in the early 70s, things were changing, of course. In the early 70s, women were um, still feeling the pressure to to encourage, to find someone who would marry them and give them children and stay at home. Women still felt a lot of pressure to do that until later in the 70s and on the 80s. But for a while, women still felt that pressure. In the early 70s, they did. And so a lot of less masculine men felt the pressure to continue proving that, basically raising a family was a requirement. It's just that you weren't told that directly the way, I was told you needed to do well. If you did well enough in school, you might get out of the draft. Or I finally served in the military to save my reputation. I got the 4F reversed by draft physicals just to save my reputation. I spent 2 years in the Army after graduate school, but I was protected from going to Vietnam. And I even had been an assistant instructor when I was in graduate school and taught algebra and gave people Fs, gave young men, flunked young men. I might have been sending them to the draft. So there's that whole moral thing. But that's the way it was. Men were expected to take seriously their responsibility to contribute to the next to contribute a generation to the next generation by raising a family and then by taking care of their parents. I wound up with an elder care situation because which was awkward because I didn't have any children and had been a single gay adult back in the early 2000s, and that became very difficult. In some states there were filial responsibility laws. You could still have to be responsible for your parents. So that was the way it was. And there was no, even up to the time when I wrote that fourth book, there was no, um, there was no, uh, when I, there was not very much talk of groups outside of, there was out for race, with the Ferguson riots in 2014 in Baltimore in 2015. Still remember that. There wasn't a lot of talk about um, gender creating groups, oppressed groups and marginalized groups until later, after Trump had taken the presidency, until later 2018, 2019, and became particularly prominent as we wound down from the pandemic. Then I began hearing about it, and you couldn't talk about you couldn't base a business. You couldn't talk about trans people in a derogatory way because they were an oppressed group. Well, there was another reason you needed. I had tried to justify individual rights in my writing as on an individual case by case basis as an individual thing, looking at the Bill of Rights and talking about the idea of a Bill of Rights too kind of thing, which was a popular idea we were talking about. I was living in Minneapolis, when I was there around the year 2000. But the left in the middle 2010s, and basically, particularly after Trump got in, started emphasizing the oppressor versus oppressed. You had to be an ally of an oppressed group. And that was a safer way to get your rights. For one thing, you could present it, if you had identity politics, you could present it to children in schools because you weren't talking about sex, except that that's kind of broken down now because now states are passing laws and Trump, is trying to next teaching DEI in schools and and teaching gender identity in schools, and many states are stopping it and everything, and Hungary is stopping it. We'll get to that in a minute. Um, it's actually very serious. So, um, but the reason that particularly trans activists insisted that you not question the self ID of someone that claimed to be trans, particularly a young person, even wanting the gender affirming care, or particularly or older women that wanted to play in sports, not under any circumstances, is you had to actually believe that the identity was real, or else all their other arguments legally would fall apart and wouldn't hold up. And that's starting to happen now, of course, with the Supreme Court in the UK recently, and with all the actions that Trump has taken and everything. But it's getting back in in some parts of the world to gay people too. Very, very concerned about this, and that law in Hungary banning pride parades. I don't know how it's going to play out, but since 2021, you haven't been able to display gay themed books in bookstores or show it in television or movies. I mean, in a physical store or in a movie theater, you can have R-rated movies. You can restrict who can go to the movie. I don't know whether you could restrict who could watch a parade. If you had a parade in Budapest, if they could have a policy of not allowing people who were under 18 to march or even attend the parade or attend the festival. It would seem to me you could try to do something like that. But they're getting very serious about the idea. This is one of the things I wanted to emphasize. They're getting very serious about the idea that men, particularly young men, need to grow up with the idea that they're going to have a family. They're going to raise children. Maybe if they have some kind of problem physically with having intercourse, they'll still marry a woman who will accept them, and that they'll adopt children and still have a heterosexual family norm. That they need the heterosexual family norm because of the decline in fertility rates and population decline. Some of these countries are very concerned about losing population, weakening them, and they're being able to fend off enemies or being able to survive the world when it does undergo a lot more chaos in the future because of climate change or maybe solar storms or other things, eventually that could happen, and that we have to re-socialize people, all men, and so to all men to be prepared to raise children, to have children and raise them, and all women to find a husband that they'll accept, even if it's somebody that's not as masculine or not as attractive. The whole gender identity thing also appeals to many people, because it negates the idea that if you happen not to be as well endowed physically with looks and athletic ability and masculine qualities, particularly as some other people are, you won't be thought of less. If people who are not very gendered, who don't appear very gendered in their physical appearance, for reasons maybe beyond our control, maybe genetic conditions or in their behavior, but particularly appearance, are at a very serious disadvantage. So they don't want to be identified as part of something that they can't function as and compete well in. So non-binary would be very appealing to somebody who doesn't want to have to be compared to much more typical, biologically typical men or women on the other side. So it's naturally because of the individual competitiveness of the world, as individualistic as it's gotten, many people want to drop out and not participate at all. But in some parts of the world, they want to bring back the idea that everybody is going to participate in family values, that you establish your right to be public by having that responsibility, by having children and raising a generation. That's how you establish your public importance. That's the only really acceptable way to do it in their view. And that's important for the survival of a country. And so they won't tolerate anything in public that convinces young men that they don't have to do it or that they can't do it, and young women too, or young biologically speaking. So, for years I've been putting stuff up online myself, blogs and stuff. And sometimes I talk about this, and some things I say would probably make people uncomfortable with themselves if they read it. So I'm part of the problem too myself. And I scaled back in 2022, partly because I was concerned that I would face the heat on this kind of question. And I have actually had a couple of incidents. I won't get into them right here, but I am very concerned about what could happen in respect to the fact if you're using inherited wealth, if you inherited an estate and can't account for how you can support your online activity, that I think that could become a problem in the future. I've talked about that before. Um, but the other thing is, for somebody like me, the natural thing to expect of me is to be willing to buddy up with people who are less attractive and take care of them. And if you think about the Bible, and this is Easter Sunday, it seems like Christianity, yes, Christianity, 1 Corinthians 6, I think, it really does seem to condemn people pursuing homosexual acts. Not so much, not so, well, maybe even in ancient times, there could have been a legitimate concern about public health. I mean, you could imagine that. Um, but really more about the cohesion of the community, um, that they want, if you're really not inclined to reproduce and want to be part of a separate priesthood, well, the Catholics have an unmarried priesthood. You should live collectively and in some sort of poverty and sort of live outside of the bank, so to speak, if you want to refer to Batman movies as a metaphor. You got the courthouse, you got the church, and you got the bank. And if you want to live without the bank, um, if you don't have all the ability to raise a family, maybe you shouldn't have that kind of independence, and maybe you should fit in to a family run by somebody else. If you want to have your independence, you have to prove you can take care of somebody else who's more dependent than you are, which I didn't exactly do. And, I've not been willing to give money to left-wing independent journal organizations to speak for me if I can't speak for myself. I said, no, nobody can speak for me. I've insisted on that, but I may not be able to get away with that, a whole lot longer. The way the culture war is getting, what's going on in Hungary, I think is very serious because Trump, talks to Orban all the time and it's setting an example for us. You may have seen that video by Matt Walsh recently who talked about it. So yeah, this is all really very disturbing. Um, it kind of gets to the point that this idea of how we see each other as individuals, it gets to a point where it's getting difficult under capitalism as we practice it with liberal society and individualism, and with men kind of falling off the track and women kind of taking over, society becoming feminized, with men other than the very high IQ men or the professional athletes or the celebrities kind of falling off the track and not being able to support them. So certainly not being able to support women and children or raise families. That the society is kind of disintegrated. It sort of is like mouse utopia. That's thing that Rutherford Lynch talks about in a video a year ago. That kind of thing is happening. And yeah, this is really, really very serious. So I can sort of understand from the left to want people to accept living with a more collective kind of way of seeing themselves, a more collect and participating in a group in the way possibly the afterlife ish structures I think might be out there with the fifth dimension and angels and reincarnation and all that I talked about the last time may very well emphasize a collective consciousness, which I'm not very happy about accepting the idea of being part of that. But that seems to be where we are, and I think we all are facing our comeuppance. Yeah, yeah, excuse me. We have to follow the law. We've been allowing people to be here illegally for years with parole and everything. We've been allowing people in many states not to vote without ID, particularly blue states. Virginia doesn't do that. Virginia requires an ID. And I've worked for several elections, the 16-hour days recently. I'm not going to do that anymore, but Virginia has very good ID laws, and we haven't had any problems in Virginia. I worked the November 5th election, and then woke up the 6th and found out Trump had won. Um, yeah, I didn't think there was any chance in the world that the 2000 election was stolen or anything. That was very clear Biden had won. But you wonder when so many states don't require full ID. I think some of them require to give an oath, but many people don't have IDs and just can't produce them very easily. If you really enforce that in every state, I don't know what would happen. So I just wanted to bring all this up, and it's all not looking good for social liberalism. The Hungary stuff that could really spread, the age verification getting much stricter and everything that I've talked about. So that's what I wanted to share with you this Easter Sunday. It's not a particularly happy message, but I guess we all have to play the sacral game, so to speak. And there's one for women and there's one for men. And we all have to, even if we're not very good at it, it looks like we're required to play it. So that's what I had for today. And I do thank you for listening.